Yes, excellent. Okay. So I wanted to talk about keeping a teaching journal today. When I was asked for my topic, this was like the first thing that came to mind. And you might be thinking, well, aren't you like the online teaching and learning lady? Are you supposed to be talking about things like keeping a teaching journal? Shouldn't you be talking about Zoom or Canvas or one of these other things? But I really think that right now, especially this term, the thing we need most is reflection. We need time to pause and see what's working and what's not working and how we feel about it and how we think our students feel about it. And I think keeping a teaching journal is a really great way to do this and to give ourselves time to reflect. So when we're thinking about this today, I want to start just with, what is the experience that people have with journaling and kind of get that on the table. We'll talk a little bit about what is a teaching journal, what are some of the benefits of using one, how do you get started, what are some of the topics you might journal about, and then also if there are some journaling resources that you might want to look into that I think are especially helpful for academics. And then because I do so much with the Keep Teaching website, we're going to close with some, if there's questions about that we want to kind of touch on, we can kind of close with some of that as we enter into further into the term. So what I am hoping we can start with is in the chat, if you can share your experience with journaling. And you can say, I'm an avid journaler now. I tried it for 3 days in the second grade. It never stuck. I think we all have kind of these different experiences with journaling. And I'm going to see if I can pull up the chat here so I can take a look. All right, so I see that Dawn is saying hasn't done much. Yeah, Katie started journal it last week. I think we have all been there. That is not uncommon. Okay, same with Lizbeth. I hear this. I mean, this is such a common thing. Hannah starts one every year, makes it to February, tried a few times, I can't stick with it. Okay, so this is the challenge, I think, of what we call journaling, is that it's like we start it, but it's a practice that may or may not be consistent for us. So I see a pattern here. Now, Renee may have some secrets for us because she has kept a journal since childhood, so we may need to tap into that a little bit. But this is often, I think, a very sporadic kind of practice. And I will say I only started journaling really consistently a little over a year ago. It was last spring. And I started doing what Julia Cameron calls morning pages. So I just have a notebook and I keep my journaling here. I've gone through a few volumes of this now. And I, before that, was not an avid journaler. So this is a very recent practice for me too. And one of the things I want to think about with this concept of journaling is the idea of personalizing this as a practice. So not having a lot of self-judgment around this of, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Am I doing it enough? Am I doing it too much? I mean, all these kinds of things, but really trying to find a way that journaling fits into your professional life and helps you achieve what it is that you care about. What are the things that you care the most about when it comes to journaling? What are the benefits and outcomes you're wanting from this as a practice? And it may or may not be right for you right now, and that's okay. So it's interesting too, we're seeing some things in the chat about people who've kept like a personal journal and it's not always sticking. One of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is kind of this concept of having a project-based journal where you might be tracking a journey of a particular thing. So rather than having kind of a, let me debrief my day, everything that's happened, what I ate, who I saw, with a project-based journal, you're looking at something really specific. So I would put a teaching journal into that category. It's very project-based. We're looking at a specific area of our professional life in the same way that you could keep a research journal, or you could keep a journal that's very specific to a certain kind of practice. During our COVID pandemic work from home time, I've been keeping a yoga journal because I've gotten really into yoga and have been really trying to reflect on what that practice has meant to me. So there's a lot of different ways that we can dig into this and really personalize what it looks like. So what is a teaching journal? If we're thinking about this as kind of a project-based situation, there's some things that I think kind of help make up this concept of a teaching journal. The first is that it is a method for reflecting on our pedagogical choices and strategies. So we've all had days in the classroom where we're like, ooh, that worked really well. Other days where we're like, I'm not sure that worked as well as I wanted it to. This allows us to kind of just reflect on that, debrief it, have some time with our own thoughts as it relates to our teaching practice. I think along with that, it becomes a technique for decompressing and processing during right now, which can be for many people a really difficult teaching period. We're maybe not teaching in the way that we normally would. We're having to experiment a lot. We might have a lot of extra stress and concern about our students and how they're doing, about our colleagues and how they're doing. This is a really kind of unique time to be in the classroom and to be trying to work with students on both a cognitive level, but also probably more of an affective level as we think about managing emotions and things like that during this period. I also think of a teaching journal, if we're kind of coming at it from a more research-based perspective, as a kind of field notes of our teaching practice. So if we want to think about our own kind of experiences with teaching as data and our own experiences with what we're observing of students as data, it actually becomes kind of a really interesting thing to be able to look for patterns, look back over time, see how our teaching has shifted, and it becomes this way of gathering data for even potentially future teaching and learning inquiries where we might decide we want to write something up about what we've done in our teaching and contribute to scholarship of teaching and learning. So a teaching journal can also be a way to kind of collect all of that into one place and gather ideas for what we might want to do in the future. And then I also think a teaching journal becomes a space to log some of our questions about, is there things that we're thinking maybe we want to do in the future, or something wasn't quite the way we wanted, but we don't know what we want to do to take action on that yet, And so there are ways that we can be jotting down notes, ideas, brainstorms that might be kind of coming into play at some point in the future. So I see that we've got a couple of people in here commenting on, keeping a research journal and being consistent with that, but not necessarily keeping a teaching journal. Some people actually combine all of this into one space. They have their research, they have their teaching. It's kind of just their professional notebook space for kind of collecting these ideas. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do this. And that's the concept of like personalizing the practice. How do we create something that really works for us as individuals as we think about the benefits we want? So let's talk about some of those benefits. What are some of the things that can come out of having a teaching journal? The first one I think is that we see these patterns of what's happening over time that might actually be really hard for us to recognize if we weren't kind of doing this regular reflection. And one of the things that I often talk with faculty and with students about when it comes to what we know about the brain and how it functions is that our brains are really wired to scan environments, to keep going, to keep processing, to be kind of moving and shaking as we're kind of going throughout our day. And it's actually not really a very natural process for us to reflect. The brain is used to really being on just all the time, like really kind of engaging, unless we're sleeping, like or meditating, it's really kind of engaged. And so unless we give ourselves kind of a very intentional way of reflecting, we may not do that pause, especially if we're feeling stressed or that we don't have time. So it's important that we kind of insert some kind of reflection or pause. And it could even be that these kind of TLC events become that for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be a journal, but some kind of moment where you talk about your teaching, you think about connecting with other people around your teaching can be really helpful. I think that teaching journals can also help us to feel a feeling of closure, either after a class session is done, after a week of classes is done, after a term is completed, this sense of, wrapping things up in a more kind of formal way where we can jot down what were my takeaways during this period of time, what were the things that really stood out to me as what was effective or not effective, so that we can kind of start to curate a little bit what that experience is looking like for us. And as I mentioned before, this is also a way to consider our teaching as a more formal part of our engagement as professionals that can lead to publication. And so if we are thinking about teaching as data, there is an interesting way in which teaching journals can allow us to collect that in a way that it can become evidence. It can become more than kind of anecdotal. We can code our experiences. We can start to think about the patterns that we're seeing in a more kind of formal way. I actually think that one of the most possible benefits of keeping a teaching journal is that you collect it all in one spot. And so if you do have an annual review, you have a tenure and promotion portfolio or something like that that you're working on, you have a place to refer to think about your own growth as a professional, the ideas that you have as you're moving forward. So in the same way that you would do this with your research components, you can also do this with your teaching components. And then the last benefit I'm really thinking about is that it allows us to release our emotions around teaching. Teaching is not always sunshine and rainbows. It's not always an experience that we, have the most positive associations with. And sometimes it's amazing and it's incredible and we feel like we're on top of the world. And both of those things are things that can show up in some kind of reflective writing experience with our teaching. So it allows us to kind of process and release some of those things. And I think especially right now, when we may feel like we don't have time to pause, reflect, really think about the emotions that we're experiencing during this COVID experience, it's a great way to do that too. So I see some more comments in the chat about including personal and teaching stuff. Yeah, I think that you can kind of combine these things. Life is messy. I mean, it's hard to just write about one thing and not have other things come into that as well. So I think that's really an important thing to note, is that these kind of journaling practices can be about whatever you want them to be. And then I see another great comment here about how journaling was really important in getting over imposter syndrome. And yeah, seeing kind of an earlier version of yourself and what were the things that you were concerned about at that time. And maybe now you've gotten over some of those things and it's just, you have different priorities, you have different concerns. That kind of growth trajectory, I think, is a really significant component of what gets logged in a kind of journaling experience. Someone also is mentioning blogging, and I think that this is actually a great way to think about a teaching journal that is public. You can have some kind of blogging experience where you're talking about your teaching and learning over time, and just because it's not something that only you see doesn't mean it's not a kind of journaling experience. So that would be something else to consider if you're already blogging or if you're thinking about doing that in the future. That is definitely a way of personalizing this concept of what teaching journals can look like to you. So I'm curious if there are other benefits that people see to this. Please feel free to share in the chat, or if you want to unmic and think about other benefits that you see of keeping a teaching journal just in general, or especially during this kind of unique teaching experience we have right now. All right, so Don is mentioning that he loses track of ideas, and this is a great way not to do that. I definitely feel like the older I get, the more my memory is impacted, especially when I'm stressed out. So writing things down, I think, is a significant piece with this. In some ways, you can even think about if you're a big list maker, your compilation of lists becomes a kind of journal of what you've been working on over time and what was a priority for you. William's also mentioning the blog is great for annual review. Yep, I think this is a really important thing. We forget. We tend to just forget all of the things we've done over the course of a year or several years. And having a way to kind of track this, jog our memories, is a really significant element of it. Okay, so let's talk about getting started, because I do think that one of these areas of working with any kind of journaling, especially if we have a little bit of baggage around it, where we're like, oh, I've tried this in the past, it hasn't always stuck. I think that one of the first things we can do is choose whatever journaling medium we enjoy. It can be digital, it can be analog. I do a little bit of both. I have a digital version for my yoga journal. I have an analog version for my morning pages. The other thing I've seen actually be incredibly effective for a teaching journal is to take your syllabus, upload it into a Google Doc, and then take notes throughout the term on different areas of your syllabus. So in Google Docs, you can add comments to the side. And this is a great way to kind of be thinking about your notes, your comments. This seemed to work really well on this day. This didn't work as well as I was hoping. Maybe I want to change this text out. The students didn't connect with this article in the way that I thought they would. So it's a great way to kind of be logging your kind of thoughts in the same structure as what you're teaching from with your syllabus. So this is something that I think is a really kind of creative idea in terms of keeping a teaching journal. So you also want to keep the journal in a place where you're reminded that it exists, especially if you're someone who tends to kind of forget about the journaling practice, or put it in your calendar, give yourself kind of a schedule of when you might want to do this consistent reflection. And I think it can be after every class, it can be weekly, it can be a couple of times per month. It doesn't have to be, something that is like so consistent. Sometimes we can be consistent in our inconsistency, but just the idea of what works for you to kind of do these check-ins and kind of see how things have gone. And then the other thing I think is just to practice this really realistically. only a couple of sentences is fine. We're not talking about pages and pages and like pouring your heart out into this journal. You can certainly do that if you feel like you have the time and the need. But sometimes just jotting down a couple of sentences about what worked well, what didn't work well about a particular class period is totally fine. And it's just the amount of information that when you go back and look for patterns, you're really just trying to pull out the stuff that really sticks out to you in a significant way. So that's something else that you can think about. And then I always recommend reviewing your entries periodically to look for those patterns. So if you become a journaler who is journaling weekly or who is journaling after every class, take every quarter or so, or halfway through the year, maybe read back through some of the entries and see what are some of the things that got included in the journal. Maybe there's some ideas that you can kind of scrape. Maybe there's some questions you were asking that you want to kind of ponder as you move into your next term of teaching. So it's helpful, I think, not to just write it and leave it, but maybe sometimes circle back and refer to it after it's had some time to sit. Okay, so I see some people kind of connecting to this idea of doing the syllabus journal. And yeah, I mean, journaling is one of those things that I do feel like it kind of comes to you, the consistency of it comes to you at the right time in your life. And sometimes there's just moments where we are not journalers and there's just too much else going on, and that's okay. Like it's okay to be able to take a pause from it or to come back and forth from it. There's no judgment about, the consistency with which you can do this, but it is just kind of one more tool in our toolkit when it comes to reflection. And I think that it's an important one to think about, especially in terms like this. Andy's mentioning that she keeps a folder. I don't know, Andy, are you a she or he? Sorry about that. I don't know which person you are, and I don't have you on video. But Andy is mentioning I keep a folder for each. She, okay, thanks, Andy. I keep a folder for each class I teach that's titled For the Future, where I keep notes on things I want to use, again, modify, etc. So this is a form of teaching journaling, even though it's not in a notebook, even though it's not kind of in a traditional model. I think that this is the kind of thing that works really well. And then Melissa's mentioning keeping an audio journal to get lots of thoughts down quickly using an app on the phone that transcribes the recording for future review. These are great examples of how to modify this to really personalize it to your practice. So I love these ideas. So many good possibilities here of what you can do. So some people, I think, when it comes to journaling, they might fall off of it because it feels kind of stale after a while, and they're like, what am I even supposed to write about? I feel like I'm just kind of saying the same things over and over again. And so one of the things I'm going to provide for you today is a series of prompts that you can kind of think about if you're like, I'm not sure what I want to write about today. I just want to write in response to a question. So I wanted to share some topics that might fall into things that you can think about and write about and reflect on. You can think about, for example, how things went the first day of class or any day of class. If there's a new assignment that you're offering for the first time, I think kind of tracking that and seeing how it goes is a really great possible topic for journaling. Any worries that you have or concerns about an upcoming term, maybe you're teaching in a new modality for the first time, or you're teaching a new topic for the first time. If you have a new prep, you might have some things that you're really concerned about. What are you most excited about teaching? If you have a favorite teaching activity and why. So some of these things are very general. They don't have to be tied to the specific term that you're in right now. What do you think is the hardest material for your students to learn, and what would be some maybe ideas that you have to tackle that? Are there aspects of your teaching philosophy that you want to explore, reflect on, prioritize in the term? If you have goals for your own professional development as a teacher, your best worst teaching experience. I mean, there's all these things, like tons of possibilities of what you can potentially do here. And sometimes I found with journaling is it helps to just ask yourself kind of a powerful question and then go and kind of see what comes from that. So it's not always about, logging what happened in a particular day. It can be even processing larger questions about your journey as a teacher over time. So what I want us to do next is actually to do a little bit of journaling. I mean, would this be a journaling workshop if we didn't actually do some reflective writing? I'm not sure it would be. I think I'd lose my badge of being a journaler. So what I'd like you to do is find paper and or a digital way. You can type this or write this. I'm not going to be picky. And I've put 10 prompts on this slide. And I just want you to pick one of the 10 and write for 5 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and set a timer so that we have a timer to refer to. And you can pick any of these prompts that you want. And I am seeing somebody chat with me privately. Is the PowerPoint available after this? Absolutely. And all of these 10 prompts are in the worksheet that I'm going to drop into the chat a little bit later that has all like 50 plus prompts for you to look at. So you can always refer to this stuff later. Okay, so has everyone picked their prompt? Go ahead and read through them and get your writing implement. And I'm gonna go ahead and start my 5-minute timer now, and I'll give you a little bit of a check-in when we're about 1 minute left, so you know that we're almost done. So 5 minutes starting now. We're gonna take another minute or so, and then we'll come back together. All right, so go ahead and wrap up whatever sentence you're on in terms of your reflective writing. And I'd like to give you a chance to debrief this a little bit with some folks who are here with you, some of your colleagues. And so I'm going to open some breakout rooms to give you a chance to chat with each other. And I would love for you to share the prompt you chose to write about and maybe any takeaways that came out of the reflection for you, or even just, what you're thinking about when it comes to a teaching journal, in your own kind of practice and how that might be personalized for you. So I'm going to open some rooms and there should be about let's see, 3 to 4 people in each room. And I'm going to give you about 7 minutes to debrief in there, and then we'll come back and continue on. So opening the rooms now, and I'll see you back in about 7 minutes. For folks who stuck around in the main room, I just called everyone back, so we'll be getting started in another minute or so. Welcome back to folks who are returning. We are just waiting for everyone else to come back in about 20 seconds. If you have takeaways from your conversations, we'd love to see them in the chat. So please feel free to share if there was anything that was interesting as you were talking in your smaller groups. All right, I think we have everyone back at this point. We're just dropping takeaways or kind of comments from the smaller group discussions into chat. Also, feel free to unmute if you have something you want to share from those conversations. I'd love to hear some of the takeaways or reflections that you were talking about with each other. Okay, so a great comment from Rebecca about there's things we're trying now because of COVID, maybe a little bit by force, but we might want to actually keep some of those things when we go back to our more traditional teaching methods. I think that's an excellent thing to be thinking about during this time. Yeah, I think and Andy mentions kind of being forced to teach in new and different ways. It helps us maybe reassess some of the things that we're using in our teaching and maybe add new tools to our toolbox. So that can be a really interesting thing as well. Yeah, and being inspired by colleagues as they're sharing kind of some of their reflections and takeaways from these reflections. Excellent. Love that. So one of the reasons that I wanted to give you just this 5 minutes of journaling today is to say that can be as long as it takes. If you decide you want to do this on a consistent basis, set aside 5 minutes and have a place to go, whether it's a file in your computer or a notebook that's in your office or in your home, and turn to that and set a timer and just write for 5 minutes and then be done. So I think that there's, very small amounts of reflection that we can really build in ways that feel maybe a little more realistic to our day-to-day lives. So I also wanted to debrief a little bit about if there was something easy or hard for you about journaling for 5 minutes. If this felt, like, I don't know if I can do this, or this was easier than I thought it was. Some of you shared some of the takeaways for what you wrote, and if there's a journal prompt maybe that you would start with next time, did this give you ideas for what you might want to be journaling about in the future as you think about this? So please feel free to share that in the chat or by unmiking if you want to do that. Melissa's sharing that their group focused on connecting with students individually, and that there's just some really different ways that they've all been doing that, and they got some great ideas from each other about that. So I love that idea of having a theme, with your journaling and thinking about really brainstorming and stretching the boundaries of how you've done things in the past and how you might want to do things in the future. Don mentioned that he lost his prompt pretty quickly and it became a free write. This is really the concept of something like Morning Pages from Julia Cameron, and I'll share a little bit more about her book in a moment, where you just free write. You don't necessarily have to have a prompt. I think sometimes prompts can help it from feeling a little bit stale, but you probably have a full brain of things you want to be talking about and reflecting on, and so the free writing I think can be really great. Pauline is saying it's much easier than she thought it would be. Um, yeah, some people journaling with a theme is easier than journaling without. So just having a ready list of things that you can turn to, and that'll be the prompts that I'm going to share with you in just a minute. From Noah, 5 minutes was a perfect amount of time. Yeah, it's meaningful to be able to do just 5 minutes, and it doesn't have to be taking up, so much of our days. Okay, William's sharing that tends to focus on the challenges more than the benefits and blessings that go with teaching right now. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the challenges can be kind of front and center for us, but there are definitely some things to be grateful for as we're working through these different kinds of teaching methods and strategies that we're dealing with. Let's see. Yeah, Melissa kind of sharing what Dawn shared, that you can kind of use the prompt to get started, but then you can drift away in whatever direction is kind of helpful for you. And I think Kendra's point about having practice with this is definitely a good one, that the more you do it, the more it might come to feel a little bit easier for you. Hannah did get kind of a condensed takeaway from doing this, which I think is really interesting. And then Leslie sharing, it's interesting to have a space in which you can contemplate your experience of teaching without the reference influence of a faculty meeting, a classroom setting, these externalities that more practically frame our experiences. Yeah, I mean, having just kind of the freedom to reflect, explore, see what comes out of it in a really loose way, I think can be really effective. So lots of really good benefits coming out of this conversation as well. Thanks everybody for sharing. I did want to share just a few journaling resources that I thought might be useful if this is something that, you know, after today you're thinking, I like this. This is kind of interesting. I might want to try this more. There's a great book by Danelle Stevens and Joanne Cooper on journal keeping in academia and higher education specifically. And they're kind of coming out of the teaching and learning realm, but they also talk about journal keeping in a lot of different ways. One of my favorite things about this book is that when you open it, they've color copied the indexes from some of their personal journals into the book. So you can kind of see how they're doing this. And it's a really kind of fun, artistic, creative way to think about journaling. And they show lots of different ways to do this on your own, to involve students in the journaling practice. And so it's a really helpful resource that is specific to academics, and I really appreciate that. I also mentioned Julia Cameron's book called The Artist Way, which is not specifically for academics. It has a broader audience than that. But this is a book that's been around for a while. Many of you may have heard of this. It's in its 25th anniversary edition. And this is a book where she kind of focuses on 3 specific practices. She calls them morning pages, which I mentioned, a form of journaling, taking walks, and then also taking yourself on what she calls artist dates, which is basically a way to enhance and think about your creativity. And so the morning pages piece of the artist way I found to be really helpful for people who are trying to get into journaling, and she has some prompts and things to have you think about there. And then the final resource that I have offering here is by Elena Aguilar, who comes out of a K-12 background, but she's created this resource on emotional resilience for educators. And there's a actual book that comes with it. And then what I've put here on the slide is the workbook portion. So there's a book and a workbook that are paired together. And the workbook has just some really incredible prompts that are actually built around a year's worth of activities, questions, reflections. And it is designed for K-12, but looking through it, I find that it's actually very applicable to teachers and at all different kinds of levels. So this might be something else to look into if you're one of those people today who is like, the prompt really helped me. Having a topic or a theme to really focus on was really helpful for me. It may be that Elena Aguilar's work would be useful to look into. So lots of great resources out there, not all of them specifically for academics. And so I think we need to kind of get creative in some ways about how we think about what are the resources that can be most useful for us. But these are 3 that I've personally worked with and can really recommend. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so that we can kind of look at each other here and do some more discussion. And I'm going to drop the journal prompt ideas into the chat. So you should see a file that I just dropped into the chat. Let me know if you can click on that and open it. It's just a Word doc. Hopefully that works. I can share a Dropbox link if it doesn't. Perfect. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. Excellent. So this is just a list. It's just it's actually over a year's worth. If you want to do like a weekly journaling prompt, you certainly don't have to do them in order. I think as you can see from today's presentation, I'm all about loosening the boundaries that, you know, we don't need to have rules around this. We can create personalized practices that really work for us. But if you wanted to just kind of look through the list, find some different ideas of what might be interesting to be thinking about, you can definitely see some different prompts and ideas here. And of course, add your own if there are prompts that you think would be really useful for you to be considering. So I left a little bit of time at the end because I wanted us to have some time for Q&A if there are things that you want to be exploring or talking about that maybe we didn't get a chance to dig into in this particular session. And also because we want to talk a little bit about Keep Teaching resources as well, if that's something that is helpful for people to learn more about or explore. So I'm going to go ahead and just open it up for Q&A. And Dawn, I don't know if you want to add any comments before we go into that.
I would say that before we run out of time, I just want to make sure that there is a post-event survey that those of you who want to get credit for this and are teaching a Learning Center professional development series to earn that certificate or the fellowship, please do the post-survey review. But that's all I've got to announce for now. Back to you, Katie.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open it for questions. Please feel free to drop questions or comments into the chat. And then if you pull up, I know we're all Zoom experts now, but if you pull up the participants tab on the side, you can see who's intentionally unmuting. And that means we're not talking over each other because I know there's quite a few people here in the room with us. So if you want to unmute and add something, please feel free to pull up that participants tab and just keep an eye on who's unmiked or who's unmuted rather.
So Katie, I have a question. For someone who hasn't journaled very much at all, I'm wondering if there's kind of an ebb and flow for this. So in the 5 minutes for me today, it was really, really easy because this isn't something I've done much. But I'm kind of wondering if I've done this for a while on an average Tuesday morning, would I have anything? And is that why people lose track of it?
Yeah, I definitely think this is possible. And I mean, think about there's things that we have in our lives. I call them life practices. These are the things that we try to do on a consistent basis. So for some of us, it might include like exercise. For me, yoga falls into this category, writing falls into this category. There may be other things that we would kind of include here. And when we have those long-term practices, there's totally an ebb and a flow where we're in it, we're really excited by it. Then we fall off and then we come back, and it's a relationship just like any relationship where we have that kind of ebb and flow. So I definitely think that that's why having some looseness around the rules as you think about them for journaling, where you journal, how you journal, what you journal about, for how long, how many pages, all of these kinds of things, having just a couple of sentences works fine. And there's even some journals out there that I really enjoy called 5-year journals, where there's just a few lines for each day. And then on that page, there's spaces for the next 5 years of that day so that you can compare across 5 years what was happening on July 12th. And I think that that's another kind of journaling practice that you could take a 5-year journal and turn it into your teaching journal. And so you're just writing a couple of sentences, for every day that you're teaching or for every day that you're working on teaching. So I think that just having that looseness and that ability to kind of think about what is really going to be useful for me with this practice can allow us to go through those ebbs and flows in a way that doesn't feel defeating, and that we can't like ever come back to a practice just because it hasn't been maybe exactly as we thought it would be. I do want to check in too on, Leslie, go ahead.
I just wanted to piggyback on that. I'm kind of wondering if the ebbs that happen aren't necessarily, how do I say this? I will just say, like, and this may just be me, but sometimes when I'm resisting doing something, it's because there's something there that really needs to be dug into. And I'm kind of wondering if that would happen with this too. Like there would be, maybe I would be avoiding the teaching journaling because, I don't know, I'm struggling with feelings of failure in my classes, or, just teaching stuff that happens over the course of a semester or year. And maybe, I don't know, have you had that? And when you do you have a way to kind of like ice pick through that block?
This is such a good question, Leslie, because I've recently been feeling this way about my yoga practice. I had a really consistent practice, and in August, for a number of reasons, the month has been more challenging. Part of it's going back to school. My job responsibilities have changed. I have more meetings. There's all kinds of things that have been happening. And I felt more stressed, more tired, just physically not having a lot of energy. And it has changed the practice. And I guess I tend to not be an ice picker, when it comes to stuff like this. I tend to be just a noticer of this has changed. What changed about this? What caused this to shift right now? And I think sometimes the ice picking can work if we have a very clear sense of what we want to do and why and how we want to get back to a certain kind of practice. But I think part of what you're implying is that sometimes we don't know. We don't know why that's happened. We don't know why it's fallen off. There could be something kind of under the surface that we want to explore. And I think there needs to be a kind of forgiveness around that and a flexibility around that exploration that's not a very specific like expectation of what it should be, if that makes sense. And I do feel like during this COVID period, we've needed to loosen our expectations on ourselves, on our students, on our practices, on our teaching, on our research, all the things. And so I tend to just try to notice more what's happening there. And sometimes it's through reflective writing. If it's something that's not my journaling practice, then I can use my journaling practice to reflect on it. Sometimes we shift our journaling practice to just conversations with other people and we talk it out instead of writing it out. And I think eventually there is this relationship of trust that we develop with these practices that we come back to them in the way that we need them and that works for us. So part of it is just that trust and faith that it's going to be there whenever you're ready and you can kind of ease your way back in a way that feels good for you. Yeah, great question. I dropped a link. It's not all entirely linked, so you'd have to copy the whole thing into the chat for 1 5-year journal. Also, if you just go to Amazon and search 5-year journal, one's going to pop up for you if that's something that's interesting to people. Are there any questions or thoughts or feedback about the Keep Teaching resources? I want to make sure that we leave just a little bit of space for that in case there are things that people want to share. And I'm curious if folks have been using the Keep Teaching website, if that's a thing that's still on your radar. I can drop a link to that into the chat. We are still updating this space and there's quite a bit on there, so I'll drop that link in there too. Eventually, these resources will probably move over to the TLC website, but for now, we're keeping them pretty separated, just so they're easy to find.
I will say, Katie, that we're on a daily basis pointing people toward them. There's a lot of gaps, I think, that people have in getting ready for this environment. A conversation I had a couple of days ago, a faculty member was surprised that you could record yourself in Zoom. And kind of didn't know to do that. So it's great having those resources available that we can say, yes, you can, and here's how. So it's been really helpful for us.
Yeah, and absolutely. The other thing I want to mention too, we don't have details on this yet, but instructional designers with Global Campus are working on some kind of quick tips sessions that we're going to be offering throughout this term. They're gathering ideas for possibilities of what that can look like. They're starting to work with collaborators across campus, including Dawn and Tucker and the TLC folks. And so keep an eye out for that. One of the things we're really aware of as we go into the fall term further and further is people don't have a lot of time. You're already giving a lot to your teaching, and so we don't want to layer on more of things you need to do, places you need to be, but we want to try to provide kind of quick tips, tricks that'll be like really focused, really helpful. So that's something we're working on now, and that'll be released probably in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that, and that'll probably be linked from Keep Teaching as well. Okay, so I'll open it back up wide. Journaling questions, Keep Teaching questions, comments, anything else you want to add in our last few minutes before we close out today?
I just have a comment, really, because I want to thank you for this and just to like reframe a little bit like what journaling is and like purposes for doing it, because recently I've been reflecting on some of the things that I do with my class, and I've had students give me really great comments that they've really liked some of the things that I've done. And now like I'm remembering that they gave me a positive comment, but I don't have like really what it was. And so thinking about like, I could start writing down like after class, things that went well, and specifically like what my students say, so that if I want to go back and be like, oh, right, this is what they liked, or I can pull those things out for my own purposes and also for annual review and other kinds of things like that. Or if I'm going to write, like you said, I hadn't thought about like keeping a journal as evidence for writing articles related to pedagogy. So that was something that I just, it kind of shifted the way that I think about journaling and reflecting. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this, Andy. I mean, I think that especially for some of us who are more quantitatively trained, we don't think about like field notes and some of these more kind of qualitative methods. And so that's kind of an interesting thing just to kind of throw out there as a possibility. But also I think we're used to, especially in our teaching evaluations and things like that, focusing on the more negative things. What do we need to change? What are the things that maybe aren't working well? And it is just as important to focus on what is working well and what are students really connecting with. And we know that sometimes they're not as open about telling us about those things. They don't always share that as much as they might share the things that they're dissatisfied with or that, you know, they're wanting to change. So keeping notes on that, I think, is huge. You know, really making sure that we are aware of the things that are functioning well, because we can build off of those strengths in other ways too. And we can also expand them across modalities as we're teaching in new ways. There's lots of possibilities there. So I'm really glad you shared that. And Katie's saying in the chat, once you know all the good things that are working, you can share them with all of us. We all want to hear all the good things that work. These are the things that we have, you know, this is what the TLC creates for us, is this space that we can share these things that we know are really functioning well for us and in hopes that they may work well for other people too. Any final comments or thoughts today?
So Katie,
Well,
I would
I
like
had
to
so much
thank you for
fun.
your time today.
Yeah.
For contributing to this Keep Teaching stuff. It's been amazing. The journaling stuff we talked about today was amazing. It's something I haven't done, but I think I have to do more of. I think it was a really fun 5 minutes that I got to have today. And one of the things that I try to do every day is to find some professional fulfillment. And that 5 minutes might have been my professional fulfillment today. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, great.
I'll announce again that we have those post surveys that we'd like you to complete. And next week at this time, at noon, you know, same bat time, same bat channel, we'll have Mike West telling you about things that you never knew you could do in PowerPoint. So we really look to seeing you all next week. And thank you again, Katie. Please join me in thanking Katie for everything.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I dropped my email into the chat. I'd love to hear if you have more questions or if you end up journaling. Would love to hear how this goes for you. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Bye.